Hello, and welcome to another episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and life coach in private practice in London, and in this video, I want to talk about holons. The more I've thought about it, the more I see that understanding holons provides a clear way to identify the fundamental mistakes and failures of the woke ideology. This includes critical social justice, queer theory, critical race theory, postmodernism, decolonization, and the rest of it. I'll explain what holons are and how understanding them illuminates the deepest level of where woke has gone wrong. Later, I will also talk about the Madhyamaka philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism, as it is connected to the idea of holons and sheds further light on the madness of woke. Finally, I'll talk about three modes of thinking and problem solving: linear, systemic, and holarchic. Holarchic thinking is the product of understanding holons, and I will suggest is the kind of thinking we need to solve the complex problems that we face today. I'll suggest how woke ideology is stuck in linear thinking and applies a limited and distorted version of systemic thinking. Holarchic thinking isn't even on its radar. I'll explain this shortly. I hope you'll stick with me for the whole video. I know that some of you, maybe many of you will click out at this point. It may sound like I'm going to give you a horrible brain ache, but here's the thing. I would rather reach 10 people who get something of real value out of what I have to say than 1,000 people who are either mildly entertained or just validated in what they already believe. If you have been concerned about the various expressions of woke that have taken over so many institutions and aspects of our lives, what I will say cuts to the heart of the madness of woke and will give you a robust frame for critiquing it. And I guarantee you haven't heard this argument anywhere else. Okay, for you remaining intrepid seekers of understanding, let's dive in. For those of you who have never heard of holons, let me give some background and tell you what the word refers to. It was first coined by Arthur Koestler in his 1967 book, The Ghost in the Machine. Quite simply, it refers to something that is simultaneously a whole in itself and part of a larger system. Holos is a Greek word meaning whole, and on means part, as in proton and neutron. It really is that simple. This idea has been influential in fields like systems theory, ecology, biology, and neuroscience, to name a few. It is also foundational in the integral theory of the American philosopher Ken Wilber that provides a framework for understanding the interdependence and nested nature of entities within larger systems. It describes reality as organized into hierarchies. Basically, there is nothing that isn't a holon. A common illustrative example of holons from physics to biology goes like this: subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, organism. Perhaps less obviously, hierarchy is also an organizational principle for psychological processes such as reflexes, impulses, desires, concrete representations, abstract conceptualizations, systems of abstract conceptualizations, principles, and systems of principles. It describes cognitive development. It also applies to social hierarchies, beginning with individuals, then couples, families, clans, tribes, friends, colleagues, communities, culture, society, nations, and the global human community. Whatever appears in our awareness, whether in our senses, our minds, or our social context, is a whole in itself, while simultaneously occupying a hierarchical position between the parts that make it up and the whole, which is a part of. This is just a fact about how reality is organized. It is not a mere social construct, and while it is a simple, self-evident truth for anyone who can see it, it has profound implications for how we understand the world and ourselves. The first thing that we can identify as a woke mistake is its antipathy for hierarchies. It generally rejects them as oppressive systems of power held in place by nothing more than social constructions, which it sees as devoid of any grounding in reality. Apparently, for those steeped in woke ideologies of various kinds, hierarchies are arbitrary and unnecessary. They only serve to perpetuate the oppressive dominance of those at the top who benefit from them. This is the root problem with woke, but many other problems proliferate from this first mistake. If we think of holons or nested hierarchies just in terms of spatial location, we've only the barest understanding of them. Parts aren't just nested in holes. There's a dynamic, interdependent, and interactive relationship between parts and wholes. Let's unpack these functions and roles, or we could say responsibilities, of wholes and parts in relation to each other. They're different. Wholes provide structure, purpose, and coherence for their parts. They provide a framework within which parts can function. They integrate the contributions of their parts into a unified operation. Wholes deliver what parts need to survive and function within the whole. Parts contribute specific functions or properties necessary for the whole's operation and survival. They support the overall purpose of the whole and maintain their own integrity to ensure the proper functioning of the whole. In saying that they maintain their own integrity, this means that parts also have the responsibility as wholes themselves to take care of the parts that they are made of. For example, a cell maintains its cell walls, carries out internal functions, receives energy and food, and expels waste. This allows it to be part of a tissue, which is part of an organ system, which does the same, contributing on up to the organism. The organism finds food, water, and shelter, defends itself from attacks, and stays alive. This serves each of the nested parts going all the way down to cells. Psychologically, reflexes are used by impulses to pursue desires. Concrete representations form the basis of abstract conceptualizations, on up to systems of principles which serve to bring coherence to each cognitive capacity all the way back down to reflexes. Humanity, seen as a holon, might function this way from individuals on up to the global human community and back down to the individual. At least this is how it could ideally work. We're not there yet, and we may not make it there. But if we ever do make it, it won't happen by rejecting hierarchies. There's an important extra twist when it comes to human hierarchies. With physics and biology, the nature of a holon is simpler and more prescribed. Molecules and cells are programmed to behave in limited ways within the wholes that they are a part of. Human holons, nested in social hierarchies, have relatively new and emergent capacities to contend with. Unlike other holons, humans can observe and evaluate themselves as both parts and wholes. We can reflect on our roles within a social system and consciously shape our contributions. We can even refuse to contribute. Humans experience a dynamic tension between individual autonomy and a collective responsibility to integrate into society. We can choose to go along with or disrupt, transcend, or reject the systems that we're part of. This capacity for conscious, intentional transformation sets us apart from purely biological holons. In a biological system, a cell's failure, for instance, a mutation that proliferates, might lead to disease or dysfunction. The system or organism cannot adapt by transforming to consciously mitigate for and include mutant cells. That's why people die of cancer. However, in a social system, individuals might and do get together to disrupt the system intentionally through dissent and rebellion. Such disruptions can lead to reforms or the transformation and evolution of the social system. If such rebels, like cancer cells, have no interest or ability to reform the old system or create a well-functioning new system, they, like cancer cells, will succeed in simply destroying the system that they depend upon. They will kill their host. That's woke in a nutshell. And here we've got the problem that comes with evolution and the emergence of greater capacities for self and social reflection. As Ken Wilber has pointed out, dogs get cancer, atoms don't. Each advance comes with good news and bad news. There is good news and bad news when it comes to our ability to organize ourselves into large societies. We get social cohesion and cooperation, but we also get the potential for tyranny. And there is good news and bad news when it comes to our ability to critique the bad news of large societies. The good news is that we can reflect on our social positions and roles and decide not to go along with an unjust status quo. This allows cultures and societies to transform and evolve. The bad news is that we can make the mistake of deciding that the bad news of large societies proves that therefore hierarchies are bad, as if we'd be better off if we were all just atoms. Our critical capacity can also be a cancer that kills the system without transforming it into anything better. This brings us to the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist philosophy within Mahayana Buddhism. This philosophy was put forward by the Indian Buddhist monk Nagarjuna around 250 CE. I've long thought that Madhyamaka is very similar to postmodernism, but with some important and profound differences. Nagarjuna offered a logical argument for the Buddhist notion of emptiness, which refers to the recognition that nothing we can perceive or conceive of has an independent existence on its own. All things exist only by interdependence with other things. This is called dependent origination. Most significantly, this also holds true for a belief in and experience of self or ego. This is like postmodern thought in the following ways. Postmodern thought critiques grand or meta-narratives, essentialism, and the idea of objective or universal truths. It emphasizes that truth is socially constructed, contingent on language and cultural context. Unlike Madhyamaka, postmodernism also sees the inherent function of all truth claims to be the perpetuation of power differentials that oppress people. Postmodernism deconstructs binary oppositions such as male, female, and good, evil. Madhyamaka deconstructs dualities such as self, other, and subject-object, and shows how conceptual thinking creates illusions of separateness. A famous part of Nagarjuna's argument is his use of the chariot as an analogy for dependent origination, considering that a chariot is made of parts such as a cockpit, wheels, an axle, yoke, reins, etc. If you remove each part one at a time, none of them are the chariot, and at the end of deconstructing it, there is no chariot. The emptiness of the chariot is thus revealed, as its existence is dependent on its parts. The implication is that all things are likewise empty, as they are made up of constituent parts, including, and most importantly, the self. This is the absolute truth declared by Buddhism. Yet, the Madhyamaka philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism is called the middle way, so it also asserts what it calls relative truth. This recognizes that along with an awareness of the empty nature of all things, they do appear in our perceptions as distinct objects, and there is a functional value for this in terms of what it takes to live life. While Nagarjuna used the chariot analogy to point out the absolute truth of emptiness, he could have equally used it to describe the nature of relative truth. He could have assembled all the parts and said, there you go, here's a chariot. And guess what? That would be a description of holons. It could also include a description of the usefulness of chariots and the purpose and function of each of its parts. Postmodernism, which is a major pillar of woke, could be called many things, but middle way is not one of them. The chariot is simply an oppressive system that needs to be deconstructed because it limits the freedom of its parts by demanding that they serve its purpose. There is no description or preservation of relative truth. The liberation it delivers leaves one unequipped to live life or to participate as a constructive contributing member of the larger social holon. Another difference between Madhyamaka and postmodernism, critical social justice, queer theory, decolonization, and the woke in general, is that it places all oppressive forces outside of the individual. Liberation depends upon the collective releasing its controlling grip. Unlike Buddhism, it doesn't hold individuals accountable for the ways that we oppress ourselves by clinging to our belief in a skin-encapsulated ego. It assumes we will be free when the collective stops oppressing us. We might ask, free for what purpose? In fact, woke demands that the collective affirm and include us, regardless of what kind of self or identity we are fixated on, and whether or not we make a meaningful contribution. From a Buddhist view, this is not liberation. This is just another golden cage of ego. In terms of relative truth, from a holonic perspective, it is useful to see and experience one self as a whole that integrates its various parts. It's also important and useful for that whole self to recognize that it is part of the larger social fabric that it is contained within. This leaves that empty, whole self with responsibilities to care for its physical and psychological parts, as well as responsibilities to the whole or the society that it depends upon. Or we could just say responsibility to others. This is much like an axle needs to remain strong and serve the function of the chariot that gives it a purpose for existing. Mahayana Buddhism therefore emphasizes compassion and offers an ethical system encoded in the virtues of its 6 paramitas. I won't describe the paramitas, but you can look it up if you're interested. They are a product of taking relative truth seriously. There's a danger in Buddhism when one becomes aware of emptiness or absolute truth, of becoming nihilistic and believing that ultimately nothing matters. This is why in the Mahayana there is a warning against both eternalism and nihilism. Eternalism is the belief in the independent existence of things, including, as mentioned twice already, the self. Nihilism is the belief that if nothing truly exists, then nothing really matters. Postmodernism has the same tendency toward nihilism, but because it doesn't recognize relative truth, it doesn't warn against it, and it often ends up there. Postmodernism believes that if individuals are not constrained by the collective, if there is no downward expectation or upward responsibility in a hierarchical system, then this will yield an ideal state of freedom. But because this is not how reality works, sooner or later there is no real sense of meaning or purpose or satisfaction. It puts us out of alignment with the way the world works. This is made worse by the lack of any recognition of the emptiness of that glorious self that is supposed to enjoy that ideal state of freedom. The golden cage turns to lead and sinks into a cold, dark sea of alienation and despair. If it could go by itself, that would be bad enough, but it tends to take others with it. If you're getting something out of this video so far, please give it a like, subscribe, and remember to click the bell for notifications for future videos. Share it with a friend and leave a comment. Maybe you disagree with me, or you have something important to add that I have left out. Before we dive back into the topic of holons, I invite you to take a breath, maybe hit pause, make yourself a cup of coffee, walk around the block, or have a snack. But whatever you do, come back. I have more to say that I think you will find interesting and useful. Okay, did you take a break? Let's get back to it. Now I want to talk about 3 cognitive capacities or modes of thinking that are pertinent to our exploration so far. I'm not a cognitive scientist, and I'm sure that cognition is more complicated than this, but I want to identify 3 modes of thinking and problem solving that I believe are important. They are linear, systemic, and holarchic. Linear thinking considers local and immediate cause and effect relationships between discrete objects. This is a very useful mode of thinking for certain things, like if I run a red light with my car in heavy traffic, I'll likely get in an accident. It's also useful when playing billiards. Systemic thinking considers complex interacting causal factors and patterns, both local and remote, and imagines potential effects across time. Each object in such cause and effect relationships is not seen just as a discrete object, but rather as the effect of myriad causes. There's a flavor of Madhyamaka to it. Holarchic thinking and problem solving, which recognizes holons, uses and builds upon both linear and systemic thinking. But it considers more than just horizontal systemic relationships between the parts of a whole. It also recognizes vertical cause and effect relations between wholes and their parts. It's hard enough to get one's head around what this even means. But to attempt to think this way is to confront the staggering complexity of the problems we must solve in what is being called our current meta-crisis. This includes environmental, social, political, cultural, economic, and psychological crises. Biological and ecological systems maintain homeostasis by self-regulating. There are no think tanks of MIT nerds required for the body to carry on functioning or heal a wound, or for an ecosystem to establish an optimal balance of predators and prey. These systems have emergent properties that maintain homeostasis. Human social systems are also self-regulating. We wind up doing adaptive things to maintain a homeostatic social system that is responsive to disruptions without necessarily having to consciously calculate a collective response. For instance, it is thought that free markets are self-regulating. Such emergent, self-regulating cultural responses allow for quicker adjustments to changing environmental conditions and circumstances than physical evolution. That's why we're the only species able to live almost anywhere on the planet. We didn't have to evolve for coats, for example. Along with these emergent cultural self-regulating capacities that have allowed us to adapt more quickly to various environments, we've also developed cognitive abilities to reason and reflect. We can think things through and decide upon new courses of action even faster because of this. It's a tremendous adaptive advantage. This newly emergent capacity is now very useful when we consider the pace of change that has continued to accelerate over the past 500 years or so, culminating in our current meta-crises. The environment that we need to adapt to is not just the natural world anymore. It's also the world of our own creation, which has changed dramatically in my own lifetime. Technological advances, our impact on the biosphere, and the development of large-scale multicultural societies are just a few of the changes we're dealing with. Most of us who are paying attention feel a sense of urgency about solving these problems and don't feel we have time for emergent, self-regulating solutions. We rightly feel that we must figure things out and can't just wait for some natural resolution. Thankfully, we're endowed with creative, innovative, and super smart individuals, like MIT nerds, for instance. But this great advantage simultaneously comes with a potential danger. There is both good and bad news that comes with it. Despite human brilliance and ingenuity, we are facing a magnitude of complexity that human beings have never faced before. Our earliest ancestors got by with linear thinking. The object of thinking was mostly get food, stay warm, keep safe, find a mate, protect the young, go where there are resources. Then we moved from being small nomadic hunting and gathering groups to being settled agriculturalists about 10,000 years ago. I imagine this was possible due to an increased ability to think systemically. This was necessary for the purpose of growing crops, but also to manage larger social groups. While a precondition, this capacity was further cultivated and selected for by our adaptation to an agrarian lifestyle and the creation of cities. The formal study of systems theory was first put forward by Ludwig von Bertalanffy in his 1973 book, General Systems Theory. Systems theory is used to think about and solve problems more complex than any early agriculturalist needed to face. It has allowed us to think about and solve many problems beyond the scope of linear thinking, especially the ones that we've created ourselves over the last 10,000 years. Holonic or integral thinking and problem solving is even newer than systems theory and has not yet been taken up to the extent that systems thinking has. We're still trying to figure it out. So what's the danger I referred to a moment ago? It's this. In our fascination with our relatively newfound intellectual models, these new cognitive capacities for analysis and reflection, we are vulnerable to hubris. Our urgent need for solutions to our complex and pressing problems might result in hasty decisions that inadvertently interfere with what might resolve itself through emergent self-regulating mechanisms and processes. We could disrupt systems we don't well understand and cause new problems we haven't anticipated. I'm not saying that we should therefore do nothing and just let natural processes sort it all out. I am saying that we should be careful, and that a holarchic perspective which transcends and includes linear and systemic thinking would greatly contribute to that care. This all brings me around once again to the woke. It seems to me that the woke have 1.5 perspectives. The first is linear thinking, and the other half of a perspective is an incomplete and distorted idea about systems. Because the woke hate hierarchies and because systems represent hierarchical dominance and oppression, there is nearly exclusive focus on systemic oppression. That's the only time you hear or read about systems when it comes to the woke. They do see that systems have emergent properties and are greater than the sum of their parts, but say next to nothing about the positive constructive nature of some of those emergent properties, nor the necessity for them. Their analysis of the problems that they are equipped to identify, and they all boil down to systemic oppression, and the solutions they offer tend to be linear. Here's a list of problems and solutions according to the woke. Slavery hurt black African people and their descendants, so white people who never had slaves should pay reparations to black people who never were slaves. This, even though almost all races and cultures have practiced slavery. Different groups have disparate outcomes, and those with less suffer more, so we should enforce equity in all things. Colonial empires exploited people around the world, so every aspect of their cultural legacy should be deconstructed and leave their descendants without any heritage. Some black people have been killed by the police, so we should defund the police. A child believes that they were born in the wrong body, so we should chemically and surgically alter their body to match the sex they believe they are. Many women have been sexually assaulted. Therefore, all men are potential rapists. We should condemn toxic masculinity and believe all women. People fleeing to wealthy countries from poor countries are suffering, so they should all be let in and given housing, health care, a stipend, and a smartphone to boot. Women have felt oppressed by the patriarchy and the expectation that they fulfill maternal roles and responsibilities. Therefore, they should be allowed to kill their unborn babies, the nuclear family must be abolished, and the government should support single mothers. There are economic inequalities, so all wealth should be equally redistributed by the state. All problems are due to the oppressive nature of the social holon. All solutions are a deconstruction of that nasty holon, along with a demand that it meet all of the needs of its individual members or parts. This without any reciprocal obligation that those parts maintain their own integrity or contribute to the whole. The consequences of woke interventions are not thought through, either systemically or holarchically. They're disrupting a system that they don't understand and precipitating consequences they can't imagine. It seems to me that the advent of democracy is the best we have come up with so far to accommodate and make use of the increasing human capacity for reflection and transformation. One of the fruits of this capacity has been a greater thirst for freedom and justice. Should we really be surprised that democratic political systems wind up being divided and polarized between those cleaving to different halves of a holonic perspective? Conservatives are keen on maintaining social cohesion by sticking to traditional norms, and progressives are keen on liberation and equality. For the woke, this means revolution. Tyrannical political systems, whether right or left, appear to operate like biological holons. They oppose a fixed system where parts or people are expected to fall into line and carry out their functions in service to the whole or the state. Parts are not to question the whole or demand that it changes to accommodate greater degrees of individual freedom. There is a religious creed and a set of moral rules that must be followed. Tradition is the model that must apply to everyone. Either that, or else there's a new utopian vision or a new Marxist political order that shuts down any dissent and demands compliance. Whether based on tradition or a new utopian vision, it must be strictly enforced for everybody. People are like cells with prescribed functions in service to the body. There are three ways that things can go when revolutionaries disrupt the homeostasis of the current social order, deconstruct it, and tear it down. 1, it might establish a more fair and just society. 2, it might become its own tyrannical system. Or 3, it might just create enough chaos for some other group to come in with its own tyrannical agenda. The woke, represented by critical social justice, postmodernism, queer theory, cultural Marxism, and the like, is clearly revolutionary. Their packaging and branding suggest that they are after the first option, a more fair and just society. It is unclear to me that this is what will happen if they succeed. I can guess that it will go either way 2 or way 3, either tyranny straight away or a period of chaos followed by tyranny. This is because the woke are incapable of thinking holarchically. They hate hierarchies. This is their shadow that they have been acting out all along in their attempt to impose their ideology on everyone and shut down dissent. If they manage to rip up the roots of Western civilization, either they will impose their own tyrannical system, or they will create such chaos that some other group will come along to take advantage of the need for people to have a whole to belong to that gives them a sense of purpose. I suppose there's a fourth option. Out of the chaos could emerge a new system based on holonic principles that honors both individual freedom and social responsibility. This seems unlikely to me, as we don't tend to think clearly when we are traumatized. Out of fight or flight impulses, we clutch at immediate solutions and will follow whoever offers them. The mess we are in, our so-called culture wars, seems to me to be our failure to conceive of our situation in holonic terms. We need to find a way to honor both parts and wholes, both individuals and the collective, and organize ourselves so that each can fulfill their natural responsibilities in a way that respects both the need for homeostasis and adaptive change. It's time that the woke sit down and wiser adults stand up and take a stab at solving our problems. This starts with respecting the structure of the universe. It's made up of holons. I propose as well that rather than a fight between staunch traditionalists and revolutionaries, we need to proceed with incremental change that recognizes and preserves what has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, while also being agile enough to make bold changes where and when necessary. If you're hearing this, you've stuck with me to the end. Thanks. I hope this made sense to you and gave you some new and useful ways to think not only about the madness of woke, but what we need instead to solve our problems and move forward together. Until next time, Take care of yourself and each other. And by the way, the signature sign-off of mine is the fundamental pact between parts and wholes. I hope you'll join me next time. Bye for now.